Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with fellow shooters. And I want to talk about why the camera's in my life. All of you, I'm sure, have your own individual stories about why the camera's in your life and how it helps you to express yourself. For me, the camera has been a means of trying to make a record, but not only of what we see in reality, but because of an early experience I had as a child of an apparition one night that scared me to death. That made me realize that there is a parallel reality that undergirds everything that we see and do. And that reality is a reality of the spirit world. It's not a mumbo jumbo, hocus pocus kind of thing. It's the thing that, most people, it's something that you probably realize as you get older. Some people as you are part of whatever spiritual organization you're in, but I'm not really talking about a particular ideology. I'm talking about the thing that exists that allows us to breathe, that gives us light. The first thing I want to bring up is, and I'll show you two pieces of work. The first piece is black and white. There was a time, and I think from my period in the 60s and 70s, that photographers felt that black and white was a more pure form of photography. And I like it because, for me, I think it captures human emotions more effectively than color. Not that color can't do that, but the issue I have with color is that the color itself can become distracting to the essentials of what's going on. But I've learned to work with it. This is a cover from a New York Times Sunday magazine story that reviewed my, I think it was my fifth or sixth book, on my looking at what I call the world family of African people, because every year since '71 I've traveled to Africa, but I've traveled to Europe, South America, all around, and I begin to see these similarities between the people and the cultural expressions. And that book was called Feeling the Spirit, Searching the World for the People of Africa. And my new book that just came out in October is a book of all color. All of my books have been obsessions. The book I just showed you was a 26-year obsession. And this book now is a 5-decade obsession because, unfortunately, my projects I come up with, it takes a long time for them to germinate and to mature. I must admit, as an artist, I'm not quite sure when I'm working on them, what I'm working on, until years later when it reaches a point of gravity, a central gravity, that you begin to see what's like in fog, something that's emerging out of it. So this is one of the black and white images of showing people involved in faith. Faith, as you know, is something very unseen. It's like air. But people somehow, there's something that triggers us to feel that there is something that we are connecting to or connected to. And we try to do whatever we can in our own personal ways to become intimate with this connection. So I'm interested in, that conversation that happens between the human and the inhuman expression of the inhuman spirituality. And so this you see is a sunrise ceremony that happened in Ghana on the beach. Here's another ceremony that happens in the water in Egypt, along the river Nile or Lake Nasser. This is another one where you're in Brazil, and you're looking at the ceremonies that people who believe in Macumba or Candomblé. And here we have in Harlem a parishioner in a church. So these moments are always there. There's always the obvious, but sometimes I'm looking for the point where the obvious touches what you can't see. And This is in Alabama, my hometown of 800 people, of my great aunt in her nighttime prayers. But then here in Ghana again, daytime prayer, the sunrise of a father praying over his son and trying to show not only the act of, but the enclosure of, the reality, the spirit. Or here in the church in Alabama, parishioners and people keeping cool with different fans that they've used to fan themselves with, or praying. Prayer, paying attention to what people look like when they pray, how they try to make a connection. Even if you go to Catholic churches, it's quite interesting watching people when they light candles in memory, or when they go to Mass. There's always that moment that they become, that the individual becomes absorbed into and enclosed by the spirit that they're trying to address. And in the very end, when we return to the kingdom of sand or the kingdom of dust and burials, and then the images of here the Muslim woman. A lot of people think this is made in some Middle Eastern country. It actually is made in Brooklyn, New York. Another Brooklyn, New York scene. Now this scene is how do I say it? It's a salute to why all of us exist. We photographers need light to make what we do work. Light for people who, in the world before Genesis, because this book I just finished dealt with the world before Genesis in terms of belief. Before we became believers in the Abrahamic faith, there was a whole big world of belief in the world of nature. And you will only see this if you go to look at ancient monuments, whether there are ancient monuments in Greece or Rome, or especially in Egypt where it all started. And what I discovered in my research was that the people, and those of you who know anything, those of you know anything about biblical texts, you may recall the story, and if you know anything about New Testament texts, you may recall the story of Jesus being led away from or captured by Roman soldiers, and it happened early in the morning. And the Bible tells us exactly what time it happened, because at one point, Jesus supposedly says that before the cock strikes twice, you would have denied me thrice. Well, those of us who live on farms understand what he means. Most people seem to think that roosters crow at sunrise when the sun is coming up. But in fact, roosters crow an hour before sunrise as the sun is coming up, and it keeps crowing. It just usually most of us don't realize it until we wake up and we see the rooster crow. So what it spoke about is a calendar of worship, so that in the time before Genesis, people will worship hours before the sun actually rose. So the sun rising was an answer to their prayer. The sun rising was a gift of life that came back. And for us as photographers, the sun, which is the most powerful force in nature, is what allows us to make our expressions and make those expressions hold fast so that we can share it with others. I remind people that in the world before Genesis, yes, the people of nature felt that the sun was the most powerful force in nature. And you can only see that if you wonder if the sun went out for a week, how long it would take for the planet to freeze over. So my book, this new book, my 9th book, Sacred Knowledge, starts here in 1973 from my first trip to Luxor. Back then I was a freelancer, and I was hired by TWA, some of you may remember that name, to go to Egypt and do a travel brochure. It was a 10-day trip, piece of cake, and it was the end of August. And while I was there, a lot of amazing things happened. It was one thing to see a 45-story building that sloped the pyramids and to see these monuments, but I'm in Luxor photographing in the Temple of Amen, or Amen, and the Yom Kippur War breaks out. And so the train just takes me back, taking everybody back to Cairo, is full of conscripts going to fight in the war. And I find out that my flight to return home, there's no such thing. It's evaporated because the airports have closed. So it took me another month of being stranded in Egypt to get out, finally by a bus to Benghazi, Libya, and then a flight to Rome. But that month gave me a lot more time to really immerse myself in this culture and to learn more about the culture and to learn about what I became to understand as riverine culture and how people in a river culture respond to their environment and how that environment influences their beliefs. Here is a processional ceremony in Ethiopia. Here is a ceremony that people hold around what they think is a holy tree next to water. This particular tree, actually, this water has an interesting story because it's not just a body of water, it's a body of water that has occupied a dormant volcano. So one day this water would disappear from underneath. Here's another interesting body of water, same in Ethiopia. Water and like air, like sun, repeating elements and belief. And then going to these, I discovered these churches in Ethiopia built in the 13th century, that's 1200 AD, dug out from the mountain where the faithful went, and they went to the mountain and they did a floor print. And then they dug down 40 feet and then 20 feet around. And what they saw after digging this out was a monolithic piece of stone that had been detached from the mountain. And they went back to that stone and made sculpture. They chiseled rooms. Such dedication that people have in the name of faith, something that doesn't really hug you back. But what I was struck about is that I began to study astrophotography. I had to because of this trip to Ethiopia. And some people, if they go to Nepal, will probably feel the same way. Because when you're so high up and the air is so clear and the night sky is so full of stars, it looks as though you can reach up and touch these stars. It looks as though that you're looking at the very floor of heaven. So then my challenge was, how do I make a picture of this that show you, given the limitations of the camera, how do I show you what my eye is seeing and what my eye is feeling? So in that, I had to come up with this idea of how you light this. And then it means that if I don't have a reliable source of supply of AC current, what do I do in the field? And that's when I discovered using battery-powered strobes. And those strobes meant I had to carry risers because it's 40 feet deep here, carry high risers, carry strobes, carry slaves, carry tripods, and then figuring out what time of night, watching for the night, that you can find that makes this kind of picture work. So this picture is very simple. It's about 3 years of preparation, but when it all came together. And that's the key, I think, to any great photograph, is that no matter how involved, technically you have to rely on different things to work. In the end, it must look very simple. It has to look simple to be effective. It has to bring people into it, and who cares? The person who's consuming it visually don't need to know the trouble that you went to make it work. And that reminds me, one of my first, I had several mentors because in the early 70s there was no school of photography. And unless you had a mentor to teach you, you were quite limited. Of course, there were photography magazines that you could read. And one of my second mentor was a man named Arthur Rothstein. That name may not mean anything to you unless you are someone who studies the Farm Services Administration photographs. But Arthur Ronstein was head of photography, director of photography at Look magazine. And through him, I learned the linguistics of photography, of visual understanding, which is a very interesting field I had no idea existed. And one of the ways that one example he would teach us about making things simple is to look at an ad and then go out and reproduce it. And that's when you discover things like the shadows telling you where the light is. That's when you discover time of day. That's when you discover how you have to deal with liquids. But the whole idea is that the photographer who created the image had to make it look effective, but also had to make it simple, so that the person who had no skills could still appreciate it. But the person with skills can only learn how to replicate it by trying to replicate it. Whether it's a studio shot, whether it's an outdoor shot, by trying to replicate what you see is what enhances your abilities and your skills, so that you can use that as a problem-solving situation as you are going forward. It's a great use of tripod, 15-second exposure. Now, how do you know? I'm telling you it's a 15-second exposure. But I understand that one of you, today there was a session on astrophotography or astronomy. And in astrophotography, you have to learn that the Earth moves 1 mile per second. So you can arrest a star if you're shooting no more than 15 seconds. If your second of exposure is longer than that, the stars will begin to trail. So you can always, with that knowledge, when you look at a picture of the heavens, you can always tell what the photographer was dealing with, what is the result. Based upon the result, you can tell what you're looking at. I like to do, lighting is really my thing. I say that light is my mistress. That girl and I, we spend a lot of time together. I pay a lot of attention to her. And I didn't really know that and how to do that until I met John Sarkowski. And John Sarkowski was going through my portfolio, and he was deciding which images he wanted to put into the collection at the Museum of Modern Art. And he found 4 or 5 he really liked. And then he said to me, he said, well, I like your photographs, but you know what I find troubling is I don't see the time of day. Well, I said, well, what do you mean? That was a new concept to me. He said, well, you know, if it's late in the afternoon, you get long shadows. That tells me a certain time. If it's morning, you get a different kind of light. And I just don't see that. And it made me then realize that there is a difference between looking and seeing. And we look every day. But what makes our skills as a photographer better is because we learn how to see deeply. We learn how to not take for granted what we're looking at, and we start deconstructing it. And it's only in that deconstructing that we then develop skills that we had no idea of. But these are visual skills that we then can employ as we continue to work. So lighting, I know you're not supposed to shoot into the light. You're supposed to shoot with the light. Fine, if that helps me say, but if I want to say something in particular that's different, I like to think that light is my friend, my mistress, and she and I can work out other arrangements. And shooting into light, for me, has a lot of different advantages. The most obvious advantage is its ability to increase depth of field. Because if you're shooting with a low f-stop, your depth of field is limited, or a long lens. But if you're shooting against the light walks into you, and the light brings what's at the distance it has to walk up to you, and therefore you get more depth of field from it. That works especially with digital sensors. At the times, I was the last photographer to switch from film to the digital cameras. And there was a couple reasons for that. One is that the technology in the beginning was very slow, and the size of the files, which you probably won't remember, I think were 5 megs. But the real problem I had with digital was the fact that inherent in a digital sensor is flatness. Of course, it's gotten better, but because I knew light, flatness was a way to overcome it. There's always in life, as the French painter Braque says, the greater the limitations, the more creative you have to become to overcome them. So in having the understanding of the limitation of the sensor and the knowledge of light as a way to overcome depth of field rendered that problem not a problem. There's also other issues about the sensor I won't go into. But here, shooting into the light again, how do we make a silhouette that works for us? How do you make it effective? And also, anything that's effective is only effective because it's simple. In my images, my cardinal rule is, how do I make a poster? A poster that arrests you when you pass it and that somehow sticks into your memory. So it's about faith. How do I bring you in to feel what is going on in that whole situation, that whole feeling? The first thing I think that people have to adjust themselves to if you're photographing faith is that you have to check your identity and your ego, because it gets in the way. There's no way that, because identity is based upon language, and the language of faith doesn't fit with any language, human language. So it only gets in the way. So you have to check that out and not have judgment and just let it roll, and essentially you become a surfer. The faith is the wave, and you just have to worry about surfing through it. Lighting again is here, but only those of you who are into light will see where it's, because the whole trick of lighting is not to show it, unless you purposely want to show it. But the trick of it is to have it not apparent. The use of side light with gases and with liquids can be quite effective. And then those of you who have a tripod know that a tripod essentially gives you light, because in dark situations, or what you do is you just increase your ISO, and you increase or slow down your shutter speed, because a tripod gives you that ability. And mixing those two things, you can turn a dark space into light. And then, for those of you, if there are places in that dark space that still doesn't pop out, then you take your flash and then you paint with it. You take the flash off of your camera and you start popping it. You just point and pop. And that brings things out, so that you overall create a canvas that's very balanced and give you what you're after. This one's an easy one, but I was dealing here with, now this is a part of, all faith seems to be connected with the seminal moments in life, birth, identity, coming together, aging, and death. And here you have a scene of death. At the top is a body being drugged inside of a coffin, And at the bottom, you have mourners and people who are heading to the tomb. And then here you have something that's quite boring, that most of us would not have any reason to understand, and that's another language, and this language is hieroglyphs. But how do you somehow bring drama to it? And that's what the light in this picture tries to do. Studio lighting can be boring, but it depends on how you use it. Here's a trick question. Where is the strobe in this picture? In the front, in his face. Only in his face. And here I ended with, this is a composite picture of that actually is 10 to 15 years apart, because in '99 I made the picture of the mask in Cairo, and I think 2010 I made the picture of the coffin, but it was a different mask. So I used Photoshop and post-production to do two things. To sandwich my mask onto this coffin. As an Egyptologist knows anything, they would tell you these two things do not go together. And then I dropped in this idea of death is about sleeping to eternity, so I dropped in to the stars. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Anyone questions, Emmanuel will give you the microphone. How many years of photography were encapsulated in this book?
5 decades. Can you hear me? Yeah, 5 decades. My first trip to Egypt and Ethiopia on Long Canal was 1973. And my last trip to finish this book was just before COVID shut the world down in 2018. So every year I would go back and forth to these. I went back and forth to Egypt for 22 times, Ethiopia 20, and Sudan 3. So another question here? Oh, then you get to bring the mic so people can hear you. This is my obsession.
Well, actually, you answered the question, but I also had a question on the piece that you did where you had to bring in all that lighting to create the light on that structure. What was the name of that structure?
It was at Lalibela. It's the Church of St. George. It's in that particular place, Lalibela, they have 11 churches that are carved out of the mountains called the Lasta Mountains. And that was done in the 12th century because Egypt was occupied and invaded by Arabs in the 6th century. Sudan was a Christian country, Egypt was a Coptic Christian country, and so was Ethiopia. And yearly, Christians will make pilgrimage to Jerusalem the way Muslims make pilgrimage to the Hajj, to Mecca. And gradually over time, the Muslim rulers who invaded and took over Egypt insisted that the Christians at the threat of the knife convert to being Muslims. So for years or decades, a lot of Ethiopian pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem were killed. So the king at that particular time decided to make a replica, their own Jerusalem, so that the lives of their people will no longer be endangered as pilgrims, but they can have a pilgrimage site in their own country. And that's how that came to be about.
And I actually recognized it, but the angle at which you shot it, I wasn't certain. I hadn't seen it with the light above. I'd only seen it from the side. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, you're welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. All the images you took, they represent very intimate moments. How do you address that, being an outsider photographing people in these very deep and inside thoughts that they are.
Very good point, because religion and the act of consecration of a moment is a very personal thing. It's you have to respect the fact that people feel that that is their unique opportunity that they are creating to have a bridge with the Creator, with the ultimate spirit. And that moment of bridging directly has an effect on their life, whether it makes them feel more comfortable, uncomfortable, or whatever. So that I like to think of, I have to approach that moment, one, of not being intrusive in any sort of way. And I have to zen myself as water. Everybody has their own element that they use to zen themselves when they try to photograph things. I was talking to David Douglas Duncan once, and he said he zens himself as blue. If he wears a color blue, he can just move around and people, and they don't pay attention. Cornell Coppa, when I asked that question, he said, well, he zens himself as head them off at the pass and just let them roll by. For me, it's water, because water has that ability. Imagine water in a brook. It has that ability to pass in and out between rocks all around them, never disturb them, and keep going. Time is water. It's constantly moving. The world we live in everything is moving constantly, whether it's water, whether it's air. Sometimes they move, their personalities change. Sometimes air is very, laid back, and sometimes it gets very stormy. Everything like the moon, we all go through phases. So the thing is, the key is, how do you sort of sink yourself into the phase? You first have to sink yourself in acknowledging that you both are humans, and you understand that you both can come to this same situation. Like we all can come to being sick or come to being death. And I think it's that sort of, because people, it's not something you can talk to people about, they vibe you on a very basic level. And if the person vibe of you is that you're not meant to, you understand and respect what they're doing, you're not meant to be disruptive, no means no. If you're doing something and you pick up that as a resistance, that means you back off. That wasn't meant for you. Maybe you'll find it again somewhere else. The key is, the object is not to force upon reality your expectations and your desire, but to be at a point when the reality offers that to you as a gift. Does that make sense? Oh, 1 and 2.
What do we have? Oh, here we go. Listen close to your back.
How old were you when you decided to become a photographer, or when you got interested in photography? How old were you?
How old was I when I began?
The question is, how old were you when you got interested in photography, Chester?
Oh, I think I was 21, and I got interested in photography because I went to visit this old man one day because I was with the student newspaper, a business manager, and we had to go to press, and he had failed to deliver the pictures on time. So I went to the photographer's house, and I said, look, we have to have those pictures now. He said, well, I've shot them, but I didn't process them. So I had to wait for him to process and make prints. But while I was waiting, I discovered that behind a big curtain like this in the studio, he had these pictures of elderly, very distinguished, dignified, old black people. And they reminded me of my great relatives, who I've never seen a picture of. All they had on their walls was a calendar, the Farmer's Almanac, and a picture of Jesus Christ. And it made me realize that, first of all, how iconic these images were, and that I had these same kind of people in my life, and also that photography was expensive. Now, my mother, who was a school teacher, and her friends, they got pictures every year. But it was too expensive for these people who were farmers. And I love them, I must admit, more than my parents, their uncles and aunts. And I really just wanted them to have a picture of themselves. I wanted to see their faces when they see me put their framed picture on their walls that spoke to their own agency, their own worth as people. And a year or so later, I began to realize that with the civil rights movement that my pictures could do something else. Well, that's why I picked up the camera. And it was very simple. It was no big anything. It was just, I wanted my great uncles and my great aunts to accept my expression of love and also to certify their sense of worthiness. There was another question here.
Yeah, Chester, your images are very powerful, and I wanted to know, when you take the pictures, do you really see them, or do you see them afterwards?
Good question. First of all, I have to say I don't take pictures, I make them. I'm always, in the act of photographing, I'm always captured by what is obvious. But I also know in the act of making the picture that I'm after what is not obvious, what is undergirding it, because it exists on top of the spirit. Now, I find that, where do you find that? For me, I find that when the moment makes a turn. You know, our life is a ceremony, and if you see the ceremony in life, okay. I give you when I began to be able to, in the beginning I had no words for this, I couldn't explain it. But one of my mentors was a painter, a man by the name of Romar Bearden, who did collages. I like to think that what Romy actually did is he fragmentized time. And Romy says to me, and he was very much into ceremony, and he says, life is a ceremony. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, everything you do, everything that happens is a ceremony. Now, for a photographer, it's a valuable lesson to you if you can graph the moment of a ceremony. So I said, okay, what's an example? He said, okay, let's go to a restaurant. You feel like going out and you're having dinner? Okay, let's graft it on your alphabet. Letter A, you walk into the door. Letter B, you look around. C, the waiter comes up, points you to a table. D, you sit down. E, you look at the menu. F, you make a decision. G, the waiter comes back. And Z, you left. Everything else happens. And Z, you leave the restaurant. So as a photographer, if you understand how to graft a moment, you never have to run after it because you know where it's going to. You know where your picture is. Your picture may not be B. Your picture may be P, or it may be G. But only because you know where your picture is, can you then make the steps that you need to be at the right place to head it off. You can make the decisions about what angle you need to be, what light you need to take in consideration, because you know where you have grafted your picture. Life is a ceremony. It happens I know our egos tells us that everything is unique to us, but it isn't. The same thing happens to everybody who does the same thing. So when you step outside of your ego and see it like that, and you see ceremony as this one big thing of nature, then your photographs, your decisive moments, they get your chances of getting what you want improve. Because not only do you know what you want to look at, and you have the skills to make it happen, but you know when and where it arrives at a point on a graft. Does that make sense?
For you as a professional photographer, is that a solitary life, or do you travel with a companion or a crew?
Well, it depends on what I'm doing. I do, until I met this woman in my life 39 years ago who's a good traveler and I like being with, I travel alone. But whenever I travel, and I'm abroad, I have a cardinal rule. I never drive in a foreign country. I don't know the habits of the drivers. And if you've ever driven trying to get into a traffic circle in Italy, you will learn the value of having local drivers. Secondly, I want to be able to look. So my job is doing my research before I make my travel. I have a ledger of what I want to see. So what I have to do, whenever I go in and where I hire a driver, a car, a facilitator, and I hit the road. And I usually spend 6 weeks in every place I go, and I methodically check off all the things I want to see and do, and get the work done. There's another question.
So, as someone getting into photography, do you think it'd be better to learn on film than in digital, or the other way around?
I taught a class at NYU in the 70s called Visual Thought. It was to senior photography students and freshman filmmakers. And the first thing I did is I took away the cameras from everybody. And for the first 2 weeks, you had to go out and shoot through a slide. Do you know how you make, I don't know what you call them now, but in the old days we had 35 millimeter slide holders when you get slides. And I would get slide holders, but with nothing in them, and I passed them out and I said, this is your camera. Because there's no camera, there's no lens that can make a picture. Only your eye can make a picture. And your eye is like a muscle. People go to the gym and they do these muscles, the eye is a muscle. So I would instruct my students to take this slide holder and I want you to find pictures. You bring it up here, you have a wide angle. You bring it there, you have a telephoto. I want you to find pictures. And in that same class, I refuse to see prints. I only want to see contact sheets because I'm interested in how you develop a thought. I'm not to be impressed with I want a thought. That's most important in picture making to me, is how, whatever thought you have, the fact that you can have it and that you can work it, and bring it to fruition is what's the most important. And you don't need an object. You don't need a camera. You don't need a film, whatever it is. You need this. This is the most important thing you have.
Okay, Chester, I have a question for you. What's next for you in your career?
Going back to Egypt.
Have you ever visited other sacred places in the world besides the Middle East?
Yeah, in Mexico, you know, the pyramids there. And in Europe, you know, churches, what have you. Caves. I'm always interested in where people find a way that they can, see, spiritual places to me are like envelopes. And wherever people can find these envelopes that they can seal themselves into and they can make they can invest their spirits into them. Because then there's some residue. And I'm always curious what the residue feels like.
Can we go to Stonehenge together?
Perhaps.
Okay, so last question for you. You've been doing this so long and the technology has changed. What is your favorite state of photography? Is it the current state, or when it was slide film, print film, or are you're full on, you're like, I'm never going back, digital is like...
Well, I wouldn't say that, you know, but you know, I've now done something. I'm doing something now that has nothing to do with the camera at all. I'm photographing desiccated leaves, and I do it with flatbed scanners. Because I tell myself that what I'm really after is trying to capture the signature of the spirit and whatever I'm looking at in reality. So I said, okay, I want to challenge myself. That's how my projects work. I always find a challenge and I then try to compartmentalize it so I can say, okay, am I really doing this? You know, da da da. So I grow these elephant ear leaves, and when they die, I hang them upside down like you would do a rose. And as they dry out, they begin to fold like pieces of fabric. And in the beginning, I started using these things from B&H, like a little tent that you can light from the outside and using the camera. But somehow that wasn't really speaking to me. And so I thought about the impossible. You know, but there have always been this experiment of taking your hand and putting it on top of a Xerox machine. I said, well, maybe, you know, I can, the idea of a light coming underneath, coming towards me in the leaf appealed to me. Let me try this out. So it meant that I had to disassemble a flat top, do away with the top. And then I had to construct a black studio over it, and then lay my film on it. And then I had to tweak the software, and I'm happy with what I've been getting. So, you know, the picture should always be about what's in the mind. The mind should drive it. The eye works with the mind. Okay, how do I solve this thing, this concept I now have in my mind? You know, painters would do it with paint. But, you know, that's not what we do. But we can take that and we can think about, we can go through this whole, you know, Rolodex of what is available to us visually and how to make some of those things that don't necessarily go together, make them work for what you're thinking about.
All right, let's give an amazing applause to Chester Higgins.